Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video we're going to be continuing the read along of the Secret Zoo Riddles and Danger by Brian Chick. And in this video we're going to be continuing with chapter 2. So just as a quick recap from the last video, the Action Scouts and Tameron went to Kangaroo Kampground to do their daily cross-training, where they met Punchy, a very inquisitive kangaroo that was very into Ella's earmuffs and Richie's flashy shoes and pom-pom on his hat. So we're going to continue today with Chapter 2, and as always, please feel free to follow along. Chapter 2, The Secret Kangaroo Campground. Here, Tameron said. This is it. The crossers were in the rear of Kangaroo Campground, near a tent that was big enough for at least 10 adults to stand in. The two flaps of the tent's only door were draped closed. Punchy was standing beside Richie, his puny arms dangling in front of his stomach. The gateway, Tameron continued, to the Secret Kangaroo Campground. It's on the back wall of this tent. Straight access to the secret zoo. No grottos. The descender led everyone inside. Punchy jumped forward and squeezed into a spot between Richie and Ella near the middle of the tent. Comfy? Ella asked. Punchy turned and curiously sniffed her earmuffs again. The back wall of the tent was made of velvet, the kind that contained the magic necessary to cross into the secret zoo. Just beyond it, the scouts knew, was the Secret Kangaroo Campground. Who's first? Tameron asked. Me, said Megan. She stepped forward and pushed against the wall, which gave way on all sides except the top. The curtain draped across her shoulders and then down her back. A second later, she was gone. Ella went next, and Punchy hopped after her. Richie followed. In the near-empty tent, Tameron swept his arm toward the gateway and invited Noah to have at it. Noah did. As the velvet stroked his body, he felt the familiar tingle of the magic moving into him. The cloth dropped against his heels, and Noah was sent to the secret zoo. The Secret Kangaroo Campground was like a big and extravagant version of the kangaroo exhibit in the Clarksville Zoo. Covering as much as 2 square miles, the sector resembled a forested campground. Streaks of sunlight fell from a ceiling of tall, full trees. Countless kangaroos were lounging on their sides or hopping about. Between hundreds of tents were picnic tables, wooden signs, and fire pits. All the tents had velvet flaps for doors, magical gateways. At least 30 people were scattered about. They wore green lab coats and carried clipboards with thick stacks of paper. A few walked in and out of the velvet doors. Magical scientists. The scouts had seen them before. What are they doing? Megan asked. The scientists? Tameron asked. When Megan nodded, he said, They're studying the magic, manipulating it to create new portals. Portals? Tameron stared a confused look at her. Come on, you guys know about portaling. The scouts shook their heads. Sounding a bit disgusted, Tameron said, The gateways that you've been jumping through? They're portals. Just seconds ago, when you passed through the velvet wall of the tent in the Clarksville Zoo, you portaled. To another world, in fact. Portaling, it's when something instantly moves across 2 distant spots. Thanks to Anu and his brothers, the magic of portaling is all over the secret zoo. Our scientists study it and use this sector to test their findings, portaling from one tent to the next. Megan said, But in this case they don't have any real purpose, right? To crossers they do. We use them to quickly cross the sector, jumping from one tent to the next. The hard part is remembering how the tents connect. It's kind of like a maze without walls. Noah scanned the far reaches of the sector and saw a light blinking above a tent, marking the gateway into the City of Species, their destination. The area between looked like a crowded suburb of tiny canvas houses. You have the route memorized? More or less, Tameron said. A kangaroo jumped up to Noah and became curious about one of the ear flaps on his hat. The animal touched it with a stiff forelimb, nervously pulled back its head, then hopped away. Okay, Ella said to Tameron. Lead the way, I guess. Just do like I do, Tameron said. And try to keep up. The descender charged forward, straight into the sprawl of tents and kangaroos. He dodged left and right, avoiding the things in his path. Hey, Megan called. Wait up! As the scouts followed, kangaroos jumped out of the way, their dark eyes wide with fright and their pointy ears twitching toward different sounds. "Move!" Ella called out to the kangaroos. Tameron found a tent of interest and disappeared through the portal. As the velvet doors swept across Noah, magic surged through his body, and he instantaneously crossed space to exit another tent deeper in the sector. Startled by his sudden appearance, a nearby crowd of kangaroos scattered, their powerful hind legs thrusting against the earth. Noah tripped on a tail and almost stumbled to the ground. Noah sensed something running beside him and turned to see Punchy. The kangaroo met his gaze in a "how you doing" fashion, then casually looked away. Tameron quickly led the scouts through another tent entrance and the crossers portal to a new spot. Noah glanced back to see they were already halfway across the Secret Kangaroo Campground. As the scouts followed Tameron to a new gateway, a frightened kangaroo darted across their path and crashed into Ella. Right before Noah portaled, he saw his friend lose her balance, then stumble through the velvet curtain of a neighboring tent, unintentionally portaling to a new spot, far away from the group. Chapter 3. Ella gets punchy with Punchy. Ella crashed onto her rear end in a herd of kangaroos that immediately took off in all directions. She stood, adjusted her earmuffs, and scanned the grounds. Tents were everywhere, their velvet flap doors hanging down. The scouts were nowhere in sight, and she couldn't see the flashing light that marked the city gateway. She had no idea where she was in relation to where she'd been. "Great!" she moaned. She cupped her hands to her mouth. "Megan!" No answer. A kangaroo hopped up to her and jabbed its long snout toward her face. Its nose twitched as it sniffed the air. "Beat it, Mr. Bounces," Ella said. "I'm in no mood." The kangaroo swung around and hopped away, looking insulted, its eyes half closed, its ears pulled back. Ella dusted off her pants and said, "Well, I'll have to do this myself, I guess." She started jogging, her ponytail swinging behind her. Seconds later, she pushed through a velvet door of a tent and portaled to a new spot, where she crashed into a magical scientist. "Sorry," she spat out. Eyes wide behind beady glasses, the scientist straightened his lab coat and propped his fists on his hips. "You know, you shouldn't be—" "Megan?" Ella shook her head. "No, the other one." "Ella?" "Bingo." Ella was used to being recognized. After finding their way into the secret zoo, the scouts were near celebrities, adored by most, despised by a few. "Are you cross-training?" the scientist asked. What's the best way to the city gateway? Through the portals, I mean." The scientist shrugged his shoulders. "I haven't gotten the foggiest idea. The crossers are the ones always in such a hurry. Me, I see no foul in taking my time. I find casual stroll often clears my head and allows for good—" "Thanks," Ella cut in as she took off running again. She weaved around a few tents and then spotted the city gateway. Off to her left, the flashing light was still a great distance away. She chose a new portal at random and dove through, ending up this time on the left of the flashing light, farther away than before. "You've got to be kidding me," she groaned. She ran through a new mob of kangaroos, found a magic tent, and portaled again, this time ending up farther than ever. Disgusted, she ran into a new tent, then another, each time portaling to completely random parts of the Secret Kangaroo Campground, startling the kangaroos in a frenzy. A few jumps later, she wound up somewhere near the middle of the campground. In the distance, she could faintly detect the blinking light. Tameron and the scouts were standing beneath it. Tameron had his arms held out to his sides in a "what the heck are you doing" way. "How did you get over there?" Ella hollered. She sensed someone standing behind her and swung around. Standing there was Punchy. He reached out and thumped Ella's chest. "Ow!" Ella barked. She cocked a fist and punched the shoulder of his forelimb. "How do you like it, you big lug?" She heard her name being called and turned back around. Beyond the far-reaching cluster of tents, Noah had his hands cupped to his mouth and was screaming something. "What?" Ella called out. A faint reply came. "Hurry up!" "I am hurrying up," Ella yelled. To herself, she added, "I'm just hurrying in all the wrong places." Something suddenly slammed into her backside and jerked her forward, and Ella was swept into the air. She came back down only to spring forward again, the ground whizzing past her feet. When she was furry limbs protruding out from under her arms, she realized that what was happening. Punchy had picked her up and was carrying her. Ella had enough experience with the Secret Zoo to know he intended to take her to her friends. "Easy," Ella said as she was bounced around. "Be careful." Punchy dodged a series of tents and leaped across fireless pits. Each time he touched down, Ella's shins struck the ground and pain spiked across her knees. The crown of her head was pressed against the kangaroo's long jaw, and Punchy's whiskers repeatedly brushed across her face. "Slow down," Ella commanded. "You're scrambling my brains." The kangaroo ignored her and continued to cross the forested landscape in massive bounds. Each time he jumped, he reached higher than 5 feet and sailed forward more than 10 yards. As Punchy bounded a batch of trees, he came upon a large herd of his companions huddled around a sprawling tent. Rather than go around the obstacles, he jumped onto a picnic table and then soared upward with a thrust of his hind legs. Ella let loose a scream of her dangling toes, skipped off the canvas crest of the roof, and a second later the duo touched the ground on the opposite side of the tent, away from the herd. "Are you nuts?" Ella yelled. "You are not a bird." Punchy continued on. He steered around tents and trees, dodged signs, and plowed through kangaroos, his powerful legs hammering the ground. The blinking light came into full view, and a minute later they reached the end of the sector, where Tameron and the other scouts stood by. Instead of stopping to let Ella off, Punchy plunged into the final portal and delivered the two of them across the magical divide into the City of Species. Chapter 4. Tarsier Terrace. In the City of Species, buildings loomed above the streets. Made of stone, marble, steel, and glass, they seemed a potpourri of architectural designs. Water spilled down their fronts, and tree limbs braced their walls. Animals clung to their facades and dangled from their decorative eaves. Sidewalks reached from their entrances and carved passages to new spots. Noah spotted the octagon-shaped library of the secret society, the vast glass walls of the water tower, and the bulky mass of the secret metropolis. He smiled, thinking of earlier adventures. In just a few weeks, he'd experienced so much in the magical world, a few steps beyond his own backyard. Animals crowded the streets. Lions rolled their heads and sent waves through sensuous manes. Running cheetahs blurred their spots, and elephants heaved their pillar-like legs. Birds punched through treetops and streaked color across a boundless canopy of leaves. Fish churned the water in fountains and concrete riverbeds. "It's good to be back," Megan said as she scanned the treetops, her pigtails resting on her shoulders. An elephant walked over to the scouts, lifted its trunk, and poked Ella in her stomach. Ella swatted the strange appendage away, saying, "Hey, go stick that thing somewhere else. I'm not a jumbo peanut, you know." The elephant blinked its eyes, clomped a foot, and trumpeted. It reluctantly stepped back, its ears flapping like two sails of a boat. The scouts' animals' friends appeared from the crowded streets and gathered around them. Blizzard, Little Bighorn, Podgy, and P-Dog, and his rowdy coterie of prairie dogs. Blizzard sniffed Noah's extended palm, a greeting the two of them had taken on, and lowered his body to the ground. Noah climbed onto the big polar bear, and Richie took the seat behind him. Ella and Megan mounted Little Bighorn, Ella in the forward spot of the rhinoceros's ride. A malachite kingfisher swept down from the crowded treetops and perched on Noah's shoulder. "Marlowe." "What's up, buddy?" Noah asked, his head cocked to one side to stare at the tiny blue bird. Marlowe snapped his orange bill toward Noah, chirped once, then looked away. To the animals, Tameron said, "All right, guys, let's head for Tarsier Terrace. Darby's waiting for us there." "Tarsier Terrace?" Ella said as Little Bighorn followed the descender into the street. "Let me guess, a terrace where 200 gazillion Tarsiers hang out." Tameron ducked beneath the stomach of a giraffe and said, "Yep, cool little spot, actually. It's where the Tarsiers train." "For perimeter patrol?" Noah asked. "You guys are catching on." Tameron led the animals down the street. They passed one side of the sector of descent, the place the descenders lived, and headed down a narrow valley. Here the walls were covered with frogs, bright-colored warnings of their position. Blue, red, orange, and yellow, they dotted the stone heights like the spatterings of paintballs. The crossers emerged at the end of the alley and entered a building. Inside, people bustled about, their attention on clipboards and one another. This seemed to be the place they worked. They couldn't have cared less that a bunch of kids were riding animals through the workplace. Another ordinary sight here in the secret zoo. "Who are they?" Richie asked Tameron. "Scientists and research specialists. They develop food." "Food?" "Synthetic food. For the predatory animals. We can't have animals eating one another. It sort of defeats our whole purpose of conservation." "So the animals are protected?" Megan asked. "Most. But plants and insects, some fish, they're pretty much fair game, as long as they're not threatened in your world." At the far side of the building, Tameron led the group through the two big doors onto an outdoor terrace. Made of decorative stone, the terrace stretched out in both directions, and followed the turns of the outside wall. Blizzard and Little Bighorn plodded up to a stone railing, and the scouts stared out over a steep hillside that overlooked a city street at least 50 yards below. Trees grew from the grassy slope and reached far above, their leafy branches stretching across the terrace. Dozens of tables and chairs were neatly arranged around them. People sat sipping from cups and reading papers. At one table were two men. The first had rocky arms, mountainous shoulders, and a gleaming bald head. The other guy had a bushy beard, bushy eyebrows, and long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. Tank and Mr. Darby. Tank wore a light leather jacket. Mr. Darby a long velvet trench coat. Tank had one hand buried in a bag of unshelled peanuts. "Scouts," Mr. Darby said as he rose to his feet. He gestured to the open chairs at the table. "Please, please." The scouts slid down their animal rights and took seats at the table. Tank greeted them in his normal way, a light fist bump with his big ball of knuckles. Podgy waddled up to the table, and Blizzard dropped to his rear end between Ella and Megan. Richie lifted P-Dog onto his lap. Tameron dropped his backpack, leaned against the stone rail, and stared down at the group from the shadow of his hat's short, crooked brim. Richie, forever hungry as Richie was, leaned across the table and eyed Tank's snack. "What are you eating?" Tank smiled, taking the hint. He dumped a pile of peanuts in the middle of the table. "Help yourselves, kiddos." Richie sang in a high note, "Sweet!" and then swept up a handful. A warm grin spread across Mr. Darby's face. He adjusted his sunglasses and said, "I suppose Tameron has told you why I am here to talk to you." "Something about you guys needing to rent out our tree fort," Ella said. "Indeed," the old man said. "It's vital that we keep a more watchful eye on the east side of the zoo, where Tank discovered the Sasquatch tracks. To do so, we'd like to move a descender to Fort Scout, which has a prominent view over the grounds. It's a perfect spot, so dark that there's virtually no risk of a descender being seen." The scouts traded glances, unsure of this. "Consider the Sasquatches," Mr. Darby said. "One has found its way into the grottos. Think of what it might do to your neighborhood if we permit it to escape. Think of the lives we put at risk. This is bigger than the safety of the secret zoo. This is the immediate safety of your world, your mother and father's." The scouts had no response to this. They all knew Mr. Darby was right. "Can we help?" Noah asked. "In the tree fort?" Tameron stepped up. "Hold up! Let's not get—" The old man held his hand up to Tameron. "I don't suppose it would hurt for the scouts to check in once and again." Tameron backed away, clearly a bit miffed. Everyone stayed silent. Richie crushed a shell in his hand and tossed a nut into his mouth. Seeing this, P-Dog jumped onto the tabletop, scampered across it, and sniffed the pile of peanuts. He grabbed a shell, sat up on his haunches, and held it up to his nose. "It's a nut," Richie explained. "It's something you can eat." He grabbed another shell and demonstrated. P-Dog studied Richie. Then he sniffed the shell again, bit into its corner, and chewed. Mr. Darby said, "We'd also like to post an animal." Noah said, "You're joking, right?" Mr. Darby shook his head. "A smaller one, and one that can move quickly to the Clarksville Zoo. We think it prudent to keep an animal as a backup to communications. What if a descender headset should fail? Or what if a descender should become injured? But animals, how would you get them into Fort Scout? Simple. A branch from the tunnels that run beneath your neighborhood. Or the grottos. We're already prepared for this. The scouts stayed silent again. After a bit, Noah said, "Man, we are going to have to be so careful." "Indeed," Mr. Darby said. "Fortunately, we have experience in this area. Think of how long we've been secretly watching your neighborhood." Noah could say nothing to this. Smiling, the old man added, "Just like we're secretly watching you, right at this moment." Richie jolted and snapped a peanut shell into several pieces. "Huh?" "You're being watched this very instant, in the full light of day, and you've had no idea." The scouts shared a half-nervous glance, then looked around, high and low. "The trees," Tank said. He crammed a wad of unshelled peanuts into his mouth and quickly crunched them to pieces. Looks real close in the trees. Look real close in the trees." The scouts peered out. The branches reached across the long concrete balcony, dangling their colorful leaves above chairs and tables. Noah didn't see a single animal in them. "I don't see anything," Noah said. "Me either," said Megan. Tank winked at Mr. Darby and crammed a few more peanuts into his mouth. "Keep looking," Mr. Darby said, "but more carefully." Noah spotted something in a tree, two round eyes staring out. An animal. It was very small. Noah could have cupped it in his hands. And furry. It had upturned ears and eyes that were huge in proportion to its body. Like a miniature koala, it clung to a branch with all four of its feet. It was so perfectly still that it looked like a bump along the branch. "I see it," Noah said as he pointed. The other scout searched the area beyond the tip of his finger and found it. "There are more," Mr. Darby said. "Keep looking." Noah saw a second one, a third, then more and more, one right after another. They were everywhere in the trees, their bulbous eyes fixed on the scouts. "Are they tarsiers?" Megan asked. "Yes," Mr. Darby said. "They're the animals that stake out your neighborhood." Seeing how small and still the animals were, Noah understood why. In the dark trees of his neighborhood, they were surely at no risk of being seen. "What are they?" Megan asked. "I've never seen them in the Clarksville Zoo." It was Richie who answered. "They're from the Philippines, where they risk extinction. They're nocturnal animals with incredible eyesight, and they're arboreal. Sticky pads on their fingers allow them to cling to things. Their hind legs are way powerful. They can jump like 5 feet high and 20 feet long. They're like a cross between kangaroos and frogs." "Amazing," Ella said as she looked at Richie. "Your brain. It's like the world's smallest database." Richie shrugged. "Knowledge is what I do." Tank said, "My little man's right. Tarsiers can see a long way at night. They can hear just about everything. They're perfect for our patrols." Ella said, "I can't decide if they're cute or creepy." Noah turned back to one of the tarsiers. With its big round eyes and dot-like pupils, it looked cute and kind of terrified, and all at the same time. It had its stare locked on the scouts. Mr. Darby chuckled. "There certainly are unusual creatures. And to think, we post hundreds in your trees at night, and no one suspects a thing." Megan said, "It's still so hard to believe. All these tunnels around our houses, and animals in our trees." A tarsier suddenly moved out along a branch just above the scouts' heads. It crawled like a squirrel, its long fingers clinging to the bark. It stopped about 15 feet from the table and fixed its wild, bug-eyed stare directly at Richie. Blizzard craned his neck toward the strange animal and sniffed its scent out of the air. "Uh-oh," Ella said with a smile. "Did Richie find a new friend?" Richie, who just dropped a fresh load of peanuts into his mouth, tensed in his chair and nervously watched the tarsier. "Why is he looking at me like that?" he mumbled through his full mouth. "And why does he look ready to pounce?" "Relax, Richie," Ella said with a chuckle. "Why are you always so worried? It's not like that thing can—" The tarsier sprang off the branch, leaving it trembling. It soared 15 feet through the air and touched down on Richie's head. Biting and pulling, it attacked the pom-pom on his cap. Richie screamed and sprayed bits of peanuts everywhere, dotting Tank's and Mr. Darby's jackets. On the tabletop, P-Dog panicked as well. He ran in circles and then dove toward the ground, but not before claiming a shelled peanut in his mouth for a later snack. "Get it off!" Richie screamed. The Tarsier jerked its head in all directions, its sharp teeth buried in the tuft of threads. It kicked its hind legs against Richie's head as it tried to uproot the pom-pom. Marlowe sprang off Noah's shoulder, flew at the Tarsier, and pecked its furry behind with its sharp beak. The Tarsier dove back to the branch, then disappeared into the trees. Richie, white as the polar bear beside him, fell back into his chair and clutched his chest, gasping for breath. "Well," Mr. Darby said as he brushed chewed-up peanuts off his velvet jacket with an obvious air of disgust, "that was certainly most unusual." "You mean for Richie?" Ella asked. "Naw, he always acts that way." "I'm speaking of the Tarsier." "Apparently not a big fan of pom-poms," Ella said. "He must have thought it was an insect," Mr. Darby said. "Insects, that's what they eat." P-Dog stood on the haunches beside Richie's chair and yipped up at his friend. Richie squinted down and kited him, saying, "Nice work, P. Glad you had my back on that one." Looking offended, P-Dog yipped a second time and then hastened off. Noah, a smile still on his face, turned back to the trees. He scanned the branches and searched for the Tarsiers again. Their faint brown color blended their bodies into their surroundings. But Noah could see their eyes, hundreds of them staring out. "What do they do here?" Noah asked. "At Tarsier Terrace, I mean." "Would you like to see?" said Mr. Darby. The old man pushed away from the table and walked to the stone rail along the edge of the terrace. The entire group followed, even the animals. Through a large opening in the trees, they stared down on the busy city streets. "What are we looking for?" Megan asked. "We are not looking for anything. It's the Tarsiers that are looking for something. They're training. That's what they do here." Noah looked around and realized that the Tarsiers had their bulbous eyes turned away from the scouts and toward the streets below. A few minutes passed, then a few more. Nothing happened. Ella said, "What in the world are—" "Patience, dear Ella," Mr. Darby said. The scouts' animals' friends began to get bored. The prairie dogs started chasing a dry leaf around. Little Bighorn wandered across the terrace, his downturned snout curiously sweeping over the stone floor. Blizzard lowered himself to his stomach, rested his chin on his paws, and half-closed his eyes. Sometime afterward, a batch of leaves off to their left began to violently shake. A Tarsier was rocking a thin limb, heaving his weight up and down. All four of his feet curled around the bark. His bulging eyes were fixed on something on the distant street. "What's he doing?" Megan asked. A tiny owl swooped down from the heights and landed beside the Tarsier. The big-eyed arboreal animal stopped shaking the branch, and the owl flew off. "Very nice," Mr. Darby said to Tank. "Very speedy execution." "Execution?" Richie said. "What are you guys talking about?" "The Tarsier," Mr. Darby said. "It sighted the target and alerted the second layer of surveillance, namely the owls." The scouts stared down on the busy city streets, where no fewer than 100 people and animals were roaming about. "What target?" Richie said. "A fedora hat," Tank said, "like the one de Graaf has been reported to wear." "Anyone see it?" The scouts continued to look down. The city street was a swirl of color and activity, feathers and fur. "We're supposed to find a hat and all that?" Richie asked. Ella said, "Talk about where's Waldo." "There," Megan said, her arms stretched out, "on that giraffe." The scouts leaned over the rail. The hat was somehow attached to the animal's long tail. Ella pulled her head back on her shoulders and scrunched up her face. "Why in the world is it taped to a giraffe's butt?" Mr. Darby said, "We trained the Tarsiers to spot the known details of de Graaf. His hat, his boots, his jacket." Noah became interested in the owl that had vanished into the trees. "So if this were a real sighting of de Graaf, that owl would alert the descender at the nearest post, then lead him and a few security guards here. "Precisely," Mr. Darby said. "Simple, yes?" Noah nodded. "It was." "Excellent," Mr. Darby said. "On that note, I believe it's time for the four of you to find your way home. Tameron, I trust you can show our young crossers the door?" Tameron fed his arms into the straps of his backpack and said, "Come on, kids, let's go." The scouts said the quick goodbyes to their animal friends. The stroke of a back, the tap of the head, the scratch of a chin, and followed Tameron across the terrace. At the door to the building, Noah swung back and said, "When will you start? Posting a descender in our fort, I mean." "This very night," Mr. Darby said. Noah felt something rise in his chest. Fear? Concern? Were the scouts making the right call in allowing the members of a secret world to hide in Noah's yard at night? Noah didn't know what to say, so he simply turned and walked off, leaving Tank and Mr. Darby on the strange terrace. And I'll stop there, ending chapter 4. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video where we'll be continuing the Secret Zoo, Riddles, and Danger. But as always, guys, please take good care of yourselves, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.